So let's bring some of these pieces together. We have a observation about social protest and some discussion about what some social theories that might help us explain why this happens around the world. We've introduced some ideas about the ways in which technological changes would begin to shake up regional and global orders. So let's bring this together and examine the effects of these multiple forces on India. Let's tell a story about India that braids together the railroad, the Enfield rifle, and the political shifts that are being imposed on the subcontinent. And this is going to serve, just to anticipate later something that we'll talk about, a protracted crisis in India that is a contrast to what's happening in the United States. It's two major cotton exporters faced with very different political fortunes. The other contrast with the Americas is we have been thinking about the Americas as the product of a series of European conquests. If we roll back a number of lectures now, we saw how the Spanish and the Portuguese and the English began to colonize the Americas by dismantling, in some cases militarily. It was a combination of military, ecological forces that drove underground many of the incumbent systems. In India, we see something very different. So one of the things to think about here is how the conquest of India differed from the conquest of the Americas. And as a reminder, remember that conquest and colonization are not just events, but they're processes that we have to think about. So again, keep these two ideas about the conquest as a process and the different variations between the conquests of Asia, like India, and the conquests of the Americas in your minds as we think about these processes. By now, in the 19th century, we're seeing the pressures mounting for free market forces unleashed by the dismantling of the old mercantilist states, and how those new market forces are going to exercise increasing pressure on India. In 1833, the East India Company still enjoyed exclusive monopoly privileges in India. But because of the mounting criticisms of these old systems of privileges, these protections, these exclusive monopolies were withdrawn and revoked. The East India Company was forced increasingly to compete with other merchants. This was a stimulus. The removal of the protection to the East India Company in India was a stimulus for the arrival of new businessmen looking for opportunities in India. Both foreign, British, as well as domestic, that Indian merchants seized upon the opportunities for the dismantling that were presented by the dismantling of the monopoly power that the East India Company enjoyed. And one of the important limitations on the penetration of the Indian market was, of course, the obstacles in transportation. And this is where the railroads really began to have an important effect on India. Most mercantile activity for Europeans was restricted to the coastal areas. But the railroad construction in India begins to take place in the 1840s. And here you have an image that I want you to consider of how European, especially British railroad magnates might have unfurled a map of India and begun to imagine an India now literally penetrated by the arrival of railroads into the hinterlands of the subcontinent. What was previously relatively inaccessible was now made more and more available for European market relations, connecting Calcutta, Madras, Bombay, the coastal cities with hinterlands. All of this was a spur to the expansion of the cotton frontier, being able to produce cotton in these hinterlands for shipment to the coast to send off to Europe. So the railroads were closely connected to the expansion of cotton frontiers. Now in India, the cotton business focused on Bombay, in part because the railroads opened access to cheap coal reserves in the interior of Bengal, so that by 1858 the output of coal was in the environs of about 300,000 tons per annum. So India could really fuel the locomotives that would ship the cotton. Most of the business in mining and in cotton production was in fact Indian owned originally to make yarn and coarse textiles. It didn't really have to compete with the finer textiles from English mills. But cotton was not the only export as a result of the penetration of the railroads. Also jute and tea from Bengal. These were rather more dominated by British businessmen. But what's important to emphasize here are the ways in which the arrival of the railroad, the penetration of market forces had powerful regional effects on India. Began to re-articulate the balance of regional forces within India itself. Away from the focus on old political power based in Delhi, increasingly to the power of merchant magnates based in the coastal port cities. As the interiors get integrated to the coasts, and the coasts are integrated into the global market forces. This is part of the Industrial Revolution. This is part of the advent of the consumer revolution that would allow us to buy the products that we used to make at home now in the marketplace. All of this economic shift coincides with a political process. I have mentioned in that earlier segment when we were talking about Karl Marx about the importance that political variables have on explaining social upheavals. Here is a case in point. For the fact was that by the middle of the 19th century, as you can see zeroing in on this slide, the fact is that the Mughal Empire was in secular decomposition. It was slowly coming apart as a result of the defection of those once former tributary allies to Mughal authority. Remember that the Mughal Empire was really one that was composed of a constellation of forces that all declared their loyalty, their fealty to the Mughal emperor, and they paid tribute to him. Well, increasingly, as a result of this rearticulation of the space of India, regions began to orient more and more towards other cities, other locuses of economic and political power. And one by one, they defected. So that by the middle of the 19th century, the Mughals were now not just overwhelmed by the power that the East India Company was able to impose on the region, but even the East India Company was being threatened by competition. So here we have the East India Company competing with the Mughal Empire, able to field very large armies, levy taxes, and create tribute, creating entire provincial states loyal now to the East India Company. But now the East India Company was facing the arrival of new threats and competition. The result was the Balkanization of India, as you can see in this image. The Mughal emperor was an emperor in name only. Indeed, the last emperor was a man called Bahadur Shah II, known by his pen name of Zafar. One of the reasons why I'm spending time on the peculiar nature of the Indian conquest is to reiterate a point that we've made about the Americas, is that Indian actors also played an active role as agents in the process of decomposing an incumbent system such as the Mughal Empire. So we have Indian agents playing a role in the decomposition of the Mughal Empire. They're also playing a very important role in allying with the competitors to the East India Company, so decomposing the power and the monopoly authority that the East India Company once enjoyed. So it's not a case of the East India Company simply replacing the old Mughal emperor in India. This was not a corporate takeover of India. It's much more complicated than that. One of the important actors in this saga is the zamindar. Remember, the zamindar is a figure who would collect taxes to make tributary payments to authorities, whether it was the empire or the East India Company. These were like tax farmers, and in return for which they would often enjoy some commercial privileges. And these, as they defected from the Mughal Empire, soon allied themselves with local princes and merchants, and they began the process of, in a sense, dismantling both the power of the East India Company and the Mughal Empire. One of the, as the zamindars began to do this, an important figure in trying to negotiate a transition into a new area was a man called Lord Dalhousie, who was the governor of Bengal from 1848 onwards, and began, in a sense, to try to reorganize India, to annex territories to their base of control in Calcutta, in Bengal. This was an immediate affront, of course, to the Mughal Empire, which was really on its last legs by this stage. Dalhousie, of course, wanted to expand railroad production deeper into the Ganges plain to bring in more of that hinterland territory to the East India Company's territory. So the pressure is mounting. The East India Company feels it has to confront its competitors. The Mughal emperor feels it has to draw a line in the sand to prevent any further inroads into the territorial strength, or what remained of it, of the Mughal Empire. We have then, in a sense, a dualistic society. Some parts of India were still locked in an old peasant world, and some parts were much more modernized. We have burgeoning new areas and cities, higher productivity, market production incorporated into the commercial global arrangements. Areas like the Punjab were booming. Others, like the interior of Bengal, were beginning to languish. So all of this is a setting, it's like a perfect storm for frictions and discontent, a very incendiary environment. Don't always assume, by the way, that economic growth and expansion, such as the one that we're witnessing, is going to be a bonanza for everybody, right? That there are losers involved in this. Losers politically, losers economically, and socially. That the growth, as the growth emerges, so do inequalities and disparities. So as nations are forming in Europe and in the Americas, and new empires are being constituted in Asia, we can see how treaty ports were affecting China, and we can consider the ways in which these multiple and contradictory pressures were also impinging then on India.